so excited to be speaking with you all and partnering with Mike. I've worked with Mike a few times, and every time I work with you all, it's such an amazing experience. So I'm happy to be here bright and early on the West Coast with you all. But I'm excited for our discussion today, Nora, where we're going to be talking about tools to fix an antiquated and broken system. I know that we both have our own experiences to really pull from, as well as research, and really just making sure that you all have an awareness of what a college music experience can be like, and what are some of the actions we can take towards not necessarily repairing a system, because that's taking a long time. It's going to take more than just Nora and I to fix a system like this, but really giving you the tools to have you all propel forward and have a sense of awareness of what you need to succeed, but also what you need to be healthy and well balanced while in this system. So let me go ahead and move to the next slide so you all can be like, who the heck are you all talking to? So my name is Alma Ramos. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am the CEO and founder of Full Bloom Consulting. I am a DEI specialist. I've been a DEI consultant for over 6 years now, but have worked within the DEI space for almost 10 years now. And so I also do speaking engagements. I'm a mindset coach as well. And I actually completed my undergrad in vocal music education. So music is something that's very near and dear to me. Higher education, colleges, universities, community colleges, those are all places that I really like to pour my passion into, which is why I'm here talking with you all today. So just to kind of give everyone an overview of what Nora and I will be diving into, we'll be talking about the expectations and reality of a college music experience. What are some of the current powers at play? And then, of course, giving you all some tools to disrupt these different power dynamics that can happen and that are naturally embedded into all institutions and departments. And then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask, feel free to utilize the chat if you're wanting to ask that, or utilize the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar, and we'll be answering those at the end. So if you're a person like me that needs to write down notes, feel free to do that. Okay, Nora, so let's get started. So we could talk about the expectations versus reality of the collegiate music experience. And I'll start going over the expectations. And I think, Nora, you can go over some of the realities of it, especially with your background in music, and you have a more continued educational background within music. But I think when a lot of us think of going into college, and I know this is what I thought of, it's when we go into college, we're going to master our instrument, whatever that might be. And then, with the dedication and practice that we'll have, and really setting aside time for that, that's only going to give us more opportunities, right? The harder we work, the more opportunities that will come before us, that will be presented to us because of our grit, our passion, and our motivation. I think also I was like, oh, I'm going to have complete control over my own path of getting into the career that I want to completing the major that I want to. And, there'll be people along the way, but it's really me that's controlling the way that I maneuver through this space. And something that I definitely thought, and was obviously you'll see will be a different counterpoint for the reality part, is that my music career is supposed to be linear. I get my grades, I study, I practice, I graduate, I get a really high paying job in a music field. And as long as I continue doing that, it's only going up from here. And then also this narrative that we've been told that being successful means being some type of professional musician, or in my case, it was being a professional music educator or director within the space. And so these are all things that I think a lot of us have been told what our music collegiate experience is like. And I would even say just on a regular higher education level, I think a lot of these can still apply even if you're a music minor and maybe have a different major, is that, you know, your career path is supposed to be linear, that the harder we work, the more opportunities that come ahead, and success equals whatever this major says that we're supposed to be pursuing as a career. So, Nora, some of the realities of collegiate music.
So yeah, going into school, definitely that idea of like you go in and you definitely learn to play your instrument, you get better, you become a master. But one thing that isn't often talked about is that only happens if your professor, your studio professor, or your advisor provides proper guidance. Right? You can't get better if you don't have a teacher that shows up to lessons, or if you don't have someone that knows how. They might be the best at what they do, they're the best player, but they don't know how to teach you to be the best player. And so that's a huge part of this, that and a reality that we don't often talk about is not everyone that's a great player knows how to teach others to be a great player, um and or has the time. If they are the best player and they're out there playing, are they showing up to lessons consistently? Are they able to be there to impart that knowledge consistently? That dedication and practice, yes, that's a huge part of being a musician, but part of it too is the networking and the faculty exposure. If you don't have faculty that's out in the field, are you missing out on opportunities or unable to network as effectively? If they, are performing and they need a sub, then that's, usually falls on their studio. So that's a great opportunity. But if you don't have that, those then you don't have those opportunities. So that's a big part of it. And it's not just that dedication and practice and self, created, unfortunately. Um, there are a lot of power structures that control that path, like your teacher, like your school, where you're located, things like that, which we will get more into. But those are a huge part of this. And unless you are fully freelance and you don't need the connections, you don't need the teacher, which then why are you in school, right? You really you need a lot of support in creating that path. A lot of people do not have a linear career in music, unless you come out of college and win a major orchestral audition and you sit there for the next 40 years in that seat. That's not a linear path, and even then you could potentially win an audition but not get tenure. You could start a career doing performance and end up a music educator, or vice versa. There are a lot of non-linear pathways. You could do freelance for a while and go back to school. You could do freelance and then win your orchestral audition. There are a lot of pathways that just aren't a straight line anymore. And I think, as you touched on, Alma, that's very true of all professions, but definitely a huge part of the reality, and goes into what it means to be a music major. And
Mhm.
then this idea that success is being a professional musician or a teacher, I feel I personally experienced that a lot in music school, that those were really like the two pathways that were talked about. But there are so many opportunities that aren't being a professional musician, both in and outside of the arts, that can keep you connected to music, that can allow you to be in music without being a musician. And, or you stay in the arts, but there are these other opportunities outside of the arts to allow you to be a freelancer in a more effective way. So I think those are some of the expectations versus realities that we just want people to be aware of and set the stage as we talk about the power dynamics within these schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of hit on some of these different areas and what's the actual impact of being a music major, of going into some type of music career, it wouldn't be us, I would say Mike and Full Bloom, if we didn't talk about the inequities that are at play, that will also affect most people's experience, career path, whatever it might be. And so these are some statistics that really stood out to us, and I would say have affected us in one way or another during our music experience. So recognizing that, there's an average practice hours of 26.9 hours per week as a student, right? And that's a part-time job on top of that. That's usually not including all of your classes, right? These are not like only, what is it on here, 7 hours on here are supposed to be like when you're in classes or an ensemble, but 19.1 of those hours are doing it in solitude, is doing it by yourself. And so as someone who had to work in college, was involved in other activities, also had my classes, and I had to do homework, that's a lot of hours that I was spending practicing specifically, and does take up a lot of time, which I think leads into this next statistic of anxiety and depression, which, Nora, I definitely want you to talk more about. This was one of the stats that was definitely, I think, resonated with both of us, but we were definitely talking at nauseum about this experience.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing I do want to point out, this does come from a study done from James Madison University, and they surveyed both music students and professional musicians. So this 26.9 hours came from their student population. Uh, and like you mentioned, that 19 hours of that is solitary. That's also, again, just practice time, which is, that's the equivalent of a part-time job. Most schools require a minimum of 15 credits a semester as music majors, especially if you are a music education major. That goes up drastically. I can speak again to my own experience of my first semester was 12 credit, or was 15 credits, was the starting point for all music majors. And then it only went up from there. I think the only time that I saw a 12 credit semester on our curriculum was, I think, your senior year, your last semester. You can sometimes get it to 12 credits. I can speak from personal experience as well that these aren't typically calculated in the same way that a normal curriculum credit hour is. There are classes that I had personally that were 6 hours a week, but only counted for 1 credit hour, which those are supposed to be a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's a 6-to-1 ratio. Again, from my own experience, I had 11 classes one semester. That's not credit hours, classes, and that only equated to 19 credits. So like on my transcript, it shows 11 classes. Not all of those, the homework for all of those is not practicing. There are ones where you have full homework just like any other course. And so this is an additional set of homework on top of your normal homework. So just something to point out as we look at that 61.1%, because that is a huge percent of this population that's experiencing that. We'll talk about some of the reasons why as we go through this, but that's an incredibly important statistic to note, because anxiety and depression also lead to self isolation, and for self preservation purposes. You feel isolated, whether it is an external factor or just an internal. Because of internal factors, there is isolation there, which can allow for more victimization as well. So it's an important, I think, statistic to know, and to know that it is so prevalent in so many of our music students. Um, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And this last statistic on here, I think it's really important to recognize that we rely on the people that are teaching us to build us up and move us forward, and also build connections with and have rapport with. but less than 18% of music faculty are BIPOC. And this was taken from the Higher Education Art Data Services. And that's a really big issue if 82% of the population are mainly white, and someone who, myself as being a BIPOC person, I had maybe two professors that I saw at my College of Music that were BIPOC, but I wasn't able to directly work under them because they were in a different department, right? So I didn't even have any sort of attachment to them. And not having people that look like you within your department really does affect how you feel your trajectory can be within this type of industry, right? So there's a lack of diversity within the music school, not just with the student population, but especially with the faculty population, and having to teach those within the school, which then affects everything else around culture, environment, and safety for students within that space. And when I say less than 18%, this is not just tenure faculty. Like this is all faculty, adjunct professors, associate professor, all of that. So these I don't, although this statistic is from 2021, y'all, that was 3 years ago. Like not much has changed since then. So if this has moved, it hasn't been by much. And it still is a very big issue within this population. So some of these other statistics that we have here are specifically regarding the music industry. So we kind of give you like a peek into what the college experience is like, but then I think it's also important for us to discuss what happens outside of like post graduation, basically. So I think it's important to know, like within the music industry, and so this is talking about mainly commercial music. If anyone in here is interested in that, 9 out of 10 music industry leaders, these are like executives, C-suite, all of that, are white and male. White and male. So there's such a high chance of the people that you're working under are not going to reflect you unless you have these specific identities. And that's a huge issue for any, again, this goes into like HR policies, and this is my consulting hat coming in right now, but HR policies are going to be at play here. Culture is going to be at play here, as well as opportunities to move up and move forward, right? Because again, the more rapport we can build with people, we usually build more rapport with people that we see ourselves in, or that we have a connection to. And so I'm not going to have a connection to most executives within a music industry. And that number gets even smaller because we're not even talking about the 1 out of 10, the 10% of people that identify as either a woman or got a male color. And so these are even smaller percentages within that, which just makes it that much more, I would say, that much less diverse, I guess I should say. And then I think it's also important to understand that only 21.4% of orchestra musicians are BIPOC, which again, this just shows the inequities at play, but also the lack of diversity at play. And that steeps into bigger issues of how the system has been working, and the portrayal of especially classical music, of it being a very white dominant space, a very elitist space for a lot of people, and that not a lot of people have seen, have been able to get to these orchestras and seen the type of success that maybe the other almost 80% have seen, that are white. And then Nora, definitely want you to take this last statistic on here.
Yeah, and real quick, one thing we do want to point out with all of these statistics is right now, most of these statistics also only account for the binary of male and female. This
Correct.
is excluding our trans siblings and our non-binary siblings, and that is a huge part of this as well. Is that isn't even being considered, which continues to impact how much diversity we see. But it isn't all bad news. We did want to throw in this one, which uh, is a double-edged sword. While we did there was a study that found that musicians of all careers are among the top 5 in job satisfaction, but that also then comes again with that 60% that are most likely to report mental illness. So that's a great thing to have job satisfaction, but to also be aware that with that there are other issues, and if we can balance that out and make sure that we are being healthy and mindful, that is that this industry has so much potential to be so great for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with all of this information, I think it's important for us to start breaking down the current powers at play, which really feed into these different statistics that we shared with you all. And again, this is just to create an awareness of what's at play once you go into a college institution. And so, Nora and I will just kind of be talking about like our own experiences and what we've seen within the music field. But one of the first ones on here is faculty paternalism. So, when I say paternalism, this is a characteristic which means, when you look at a faculty, they are the person who has all of the answers, who has all of the right answers, and can tell you what to do. So that's what we mean in that space. So it is a very one track way of someone advising you, of teaching you, and it's not an exchange of information or passion. It's you listen to this one person and you're supposed to be able to move forward, to be able to excel in your career. But as we explained earlier, this only depends on if your professor can teach and that they're not just a master of their own instrument. Do they expose you to the network that they have, or can they expose you to other people who have a bigger network to propel you in career? So these are all things that will affect your curriculum, right? What is being taught within the classrooms? What is being taught within your studios? What is being taught within your ensembles? Are there musics from different culture that are being explained? Are we learning about the history of different composers and different people that have impacted music as a whole that don't just fit this Eurocentric point of view, right? That don't just fit this one specific mold, because we always say music is a universal language. But I can tell you as a musician, that is not necessarily the case. There is a specific language that you have to speak in being a musician. And there's certain composers, certain types of music, all of that, that are deemed as worthy of learning or studying or anything like that. And then there's your private lessons. And I know that, Nora, you can definitely dive deeper into this, but you're having a one-on-one time with a professor who, especially if you're going into any type of music performance field, has so much control over your future and your success, not only as a music student, but as a musician post graduation, right? So, what are they able to provide for you? What are they actually advising you? What type of resources are they providing you support, and not just support as a student, but like as a human being? Are they giving you the tools that you need in order to be successful as you fulfill your career path, which goes forward? And definitely want to toss it over to you, Nora, to dive a little bit more into that.
Yeah, as you mentioned, again, it only is helpful if they know how to make you a better player. And one thing that sometimes isn't talked about is a lot of the faculty that goes into studio positions. They were performance majors, right? They are incredible performers, but they did not get training in being an educator. They were not music education majors, and that's not true for all of them. And there are plenty of professors, they do have to teach themselves how to play at some point. They learn from others, etc. But not everyone is has that training to know how to teach others. And out of those as well, like something that works for them, and they're like, well, this is this is how you learn might not work for all of their students. And not having, um, a huge wealth of knowledge in different types of teaching, different philosophies and curriculums and um, pieces of that can be a huge deficit, and can hurt students who maybe don't learn the same way. So if there aren't these skill sets and these tactics and understanding of um, just different methodology, that can lead to students not getting the most out of their lessons each week. And that is a huge part of why you go to school, is for those private lessons. And so I think that's a huge thing, as well as then again, I mentioned um, faculty and their own ability to manage their time, to show up for their students, things like that. When you have professors that are actively performing, it might not be in the same city, it might be in a different part of the country or a different part of the world. And that can be incredibly difficult as well. I can speak again to my own experience of my professor would frequently miss lessons. And if I could teach myself to play my instrument better, I wouldn't have paid all of that money to go to school, right? Like that's kind of at the bare minimum, kind of a lot of times why people go to school is for those lessons. That is the biggest part of your curriculum. You have, for anyone that isn't in school or doesn't realize, especially parents, like you're in a lesson with this professor once a week, every week. That is the biggest part of your curriculum. That's really why you're going. And then on top of that, you also then have studio classes. You might have other coachings with them. And that really is the thing that's like that determining factor. And knowing whether or not they're going to be able to A, show up for you, and B, teach you in a way that's going to be effective, can be incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even diving into the other paternalism aspect onto here with career path, Nora and I are both people who have music majors and who are doing work outside of what was expected of us within the music field. Um, are we still musicians today? Absolutely. I need music. That's why I pursued it. It is something that still fulfills me. And I wish that I was able to have discussions with my faculty about the different areas that I could explore that would still use my music degree. And I was music education, right? And that is a field that is very narrow, that is seen, let me rephrase that is seen as very narrow of what you can do with that degree. And so for me it was like, okay, I'm going to graduate, I'm going to become a choral conductor, and I'm going to teach high schoolers like right off the bat. I ended up having to change my major during my senior year because of the inability I had to do student teaching, because I wouldn't be able to work during that time. I was an out-of-state student, and I was expected to teach in the state that my school was in, but I didn't have any family there. I didn't have any friends that I was that close with that I could stay at their family's house or anything like that. So being a music teacher got taken out of my career path because I wasn't in a a space that I was able to pursue that career, like just from a financial aspect, even. And so I had to change it to educational studies, which was a path that I never knew existed until my senior year when I had this hard discussion with my advisor. And it was something that I was like, like I wish that this was discussed about beforehand, or seen as a path, because I actually do enjoy doing research. It's something that maybe I would have had as a major beforehand. But it wasn't ever presented to me as an option until, it was I'm trying to think of sports analogies, and I should have known better. I don't sport. But it was at the last minute type of thing, that, and we were trying to find a solution because I couldn't be there more than 4 years. And that also is a feat within itself of being a music educator. And so my once I got past that hump, that's when I realized, oh, this absolutely is like my career is absolutely not going to be linear because I'm not going to pursue it in the way that I originally had in mind and that I had also been told is the only option for me with this career path. And I think that's something that I wish that more faculty and staff played around with and open that curiosity more for the students that they're working with. So another aspect that's at play is quantity over quality, and that higher quantity equals more success. So this is an all-around thing. We can talk about this within just the music department, but this is honestly colleges and higher education institutions as a whole. When we think of diversity and when we think of inclusion and all of that, we think of numbers of people, right? We even showed you the percentages of how many people were BIPOC people were students or in an orchestra. And so we have equated success to having higher quantities of whatever demographics are in play, whether it's people who identify as non-binary, LGBTQ community, women, BIPOC, people with disabilities, so on and so forth. And recruitment gets such the highlight of it and getting students in, but what happens is because the quality of the actual institution itself, of the department, of the faculty, of everyone in there, it's not sustainable to keep people with these different identities in that space. So we may have the numbers there, but are the people actually enjoying their experience there? Are they actually, feeling supported? And where did they go post graduation? Did they change their major, which is not a bad thing? Again, I changed my major. 80% of undergraduate students change their major at least once. So again, that exploration and all of that. But, or I should say, and we need to be able to build an environment where students feel safe enough to ask questions, to push the institution to be more equitable and to have the resources that we need to be successful. And going along with what Nora mentioned previously, I also was a person who had to take an extreme amount of credit hours. I was in a choir that practiced for about 2 hours, 3 days a week, which should have been at least 6 credits. It was one. I was taking private lessons once a week, which was 1 credit, but then I was taking classes that were 3 times a week that were only 2 credits. So and everyone else that I knew that were in other majors, it was balanced. It was like if I was there 3 times a week, they were to had 3 credits. If I was there 2 days a week, it was 2 credits by that hour. And it really, spread me too thin. My schedule was crazy, but it was a schedule that was I was told by faculty and other classmates and people within the music department, like, no, that's good. Like, that means that you're like working hard if you basically have no time. I even had an experience where the max credit hours that I was able to take, I believe, was 18 credits. The average credit hours was 12. But the max I could take without needing a signature from an advisor is 18. One of the semesters that I took classes, I took 21. Again, this is past the limit, and I was doing way more classes than some of my other peers. And I went into speak with my advisor, and they saw how many credit hours I was taking. And she was like, whoa, like, why do you need to take that many credit hours? And I told her that I was a music education major, and she was like, oh, okay, and signed off on it right away. Like, no other questions asked. Like, she knew I was music education, so she signed off on it because that became the norm for us. That became the norm. And so it also made it that much more difficult to graduate within 4 years, which again is another layer of inequity when we think of finances. And not everyone is able to afford 5 years at a college for even an extra semester. And so by the end of my undergrad experience, I was extremely burnt out. extremely burnt out to the point where I was like, I don't even think I'm going to do music anymore. And like, obviously, I'm doing it now, but this is the practices that are seen as normal within a music institution is these packing on of credit hours, plus on top of that 19.1 hours of solitary practice that Nora was talking about. And let's hope that you have, you know, some paid gigs. If not, I'm hoping some people won't have to work during that time, but that's not the reality for most college students, is that most of us have to have some type of income coming in to pay for whatever it might be, unless you're lucky enough that your parents or guardians are able to pay for everything. So Nora, definitely want to pass this over to you if you have anything else to add on this point.
Yeah, I think one of the things as we were building this presentation that we talked about too was, but why is that the norm? That kind of kept being our question. And I think this next little section, we started exploring that why, and we started exploring why these powers exist, why these power dynamics exist, and not just at these institutions, but specifically deeper into these colleges of music. And one thing that we kept coming back to were these parallels to groupthink and high control tactics. And this is not us saying that anyone in this system is intentionally creating, you in specifically saying like, I'm going to isolate them, I'm going to use thought reform, I'm going to XYZ. But when this is inherently baked into the system, which we'll explain each of these, that then leads to the power dynamics that are at play. And so the first one is isolation. And so, you've already touched on this. We touched on it with just the isolation of practicing alone, but these one-on-one lessons, this idea that in a lot of music schools there is an elitism, there is a kind of community-based isolation, that you stay in the music school. Your curriculum is all based in the music school. I think out of 140 credits, I only had 30 that I could even use outside of the music school if I wanted. And so you're really in this school, and these are very small. This isn't, the arts and science college where there might be 30,000 students in there alone, or 15,000 students. My school was 500 students. One of the biggest music schools I've seen is like 1,500, which is tiny compared to a university and having the freedom to take other courses. And yes, we see this in other schools. We see this in specific cohorts. We see this in certain programs. And that's the point, right? When you are already very much isolated by your curriculum, and then deeper than that, there is this mindset of, well, we only hang out with other music kids. I can't tell you how many times I heard that in my undergrad, and saw that was music kids that just hung out with other music kids,
Yes.
that didn't participate in any campus wide activities or programs, that there was this elitism within the programming, and within the culture of the institutions, that the more you practice, the more you do these things, like, and it's self isolating in that sense.
Mhm.
um altering practices. So sleep deprivation is one of the biggest tactics used by high control groups in general. That's when you'll always hear about if you study high control groups, is sleep deprivation. You hear about that even in things like police interrogations where they're coerced. Coercion tactics is sleep deprivation. So while not intentionally baked into this, once it is baked in, that is, can lead people to becoming victims. It predisposes people to being coerced, to being victimized. And that's the important thing to know about, I think, all of these tactics, is just the awareness around them. Some of the other ones that we found really interesting, so it listed sleep deprivation, meditation, chanting, and drugs, which all of those can be used as part of the creative process. Right? Like there are eras where drug use was intentionally used in the music creation process. There are eras where chanting or meditation are very much a part of the creative process. And then the sleep deprivation. And so when that is already, again, baked into your process, into your institution or your structure, then you are predisposed to, you know, um, mind alteration, right? Like you can be sort of led to think something or coerced into something without even realizing it. You're just more susceptible, and that's what's important about that. Um and then punishment and deprivation against rewards. So things like, if your scholarship is tied to one specific person, um and that's your studio typically, and like I had this experience. My scholarship was tied directly to my school and my studio. So if I wasn't taking those lessons, I couldn't have my scholarship. And that was a frequent threat was, well, then you can leave this studio or you can get out. If you don't like the way we do it, then you can leave this studio. And that's a financial threat. If that's the only way you could afford this school, that's a huge that is a huge punishment and deprivation tactic. So financial isn't the only one. There are things like you'll be in the worst band, you won't be used for subbing opportunities, so you won't be invited to those extra opportunities that are going to be the thing that can make or break your success long term. And then a lot of social status is tied to these things as well. If you're your teacher's favorite, that can lead to whether or not you have friends in the music school. Again, this like baked in elitism and isolation that can come from this competitiveness within these schools is a huge one. So, where you sit in your ensemble, what chair you are, things like that can lead to it. I mean, again, speaking from my experiences, I heard so many stories and firsthand saw people that were like, "Oh, I don't know why that person is dating this other person. Their last chair in a different ensemble." Like there was all of your self worth and value. I see you smiling, home, but that was very real. And I remember my dean talking about it in one of our freshman year classes, and how we shouldn't have that mindset. But then I remember like 3 years later hearing that exact same thing being said by classmates, right? um and so it sounds insane, but when you're in it, that is your social currency, is where you sit, how successful you are. People either want to be your friend or don't because they think you're going to be successful based on where you're seated in an ensemble. And that's a huge thing, it is your social currency. And so when that is tied to this one specific person who tends to make that decision, or even maybe a couple of people, your band director and your personal faculty, studio professor, that can affect your ability to get through school. That can increase your chances of being part of that 61% of students that have anxiety and depression. So I think that's a really important thing to be aware of. And then on the flip side of that, the rewards of lessons. If you're the favorite, you might get extra lessons. And that's the whole reason you're there, right? So if you get that extra time, if you get extra rehearsal time, or those opportunities to sub and sit alongside your professor in a professional orchestra, those can be used as kind of a carrot, so to speak, a stick or a carrot. And yes, that can be a healthy thing. That can be a really great thing to aspire to. Those can be great rewards, but also just that awareness. Love bombing, and the way that our lesson structures work when you're one on one with someone and you're getting all of this attention and time when things are going really well. Is it that your teacher is being supportive, or is it sort of verging on love bombing? And I think that that is really, really important to be aware of and to have those conversations. Another thing that they frequently talk about with high control groups is recruitment. And that's a really important part. And we were I think we initially kind of saw this when we were like, oh, I don't know that that applies. But then we started talking about it, and the studios with the best numbers, with the highest, like, quote unquote success rates and graduation rates and recruitment rates, all of that is tied to the resources that those studios get. So what kind of funding do they get? What kind of opportunities they get? Maybe, some of those top performing ones, they might have opportunities to be part of projects within the school or to get certain funding. The studios that do the best have the best scholarship opportunities. And so it's in the student's best interest as well to to be successful in this one way that is school and this structure, um and that can lead to problems as well. So again, not every school, not every studio. This isn't just inherently bad, but these are things to be aware of and say, is this a healthy environment? Is this a healthy structure? Or are we starting to verge on this is creating the opportunities if there are bad actors for coercion, for manipulation. I think that it's just something to be aware of. And then thought reform. So again, really, really rigid right and wrong, yes and no, the really, really binary existence in this world of what is success. You either fail or, there are a lot of classes where they are pass fail basically. Did you
Mm.
pass your lessons? Did you fail your lessons? Did you get into that ensemble? Did you not? So these really, really rigid rules that come from the way we do things in classical music and Western classical music and Eurocentric classical music of we don't use a third here. You can't have parallel fifths. Like, right? Like that seems so silly and that's music theory based, but you can expand that so much further when that is the rigidness of what this art form is. And yes, it has expanded, but a lot of that rigidity is baked in, and that starts to affect your thought process and the way you think about yourself and your music and where you are. So I think that that's an important thing to just be aware of.
Yeah. And I think it's important for us, and we're gonna break down a little bit more of like the power structures at play. But kind of piggybacking off of what you mentioned, Nora, a lot of the reasons why these practices are normalized is because of this Eurocentrism of there's a an article and we and both Nora and I linked where we got these from, but one of my favorite articles is called White Supremacy Characteristics by Tema Okun, and it talks about not how we may be intentionally like so many of us when we hear white supremacy, like we automatically like get our guard up and like our ego is there to like help protect us, and we're like we don't want anything to do with that, which is great. You shouldn't want to have anything to do with white supremacy. And we have to remember that colleges and higher ed institutions were made with white supremacy characteristics. There were no women in these areas. There were no people of color that were allowed to be at colleges. Therefore, there was a single track way of us seeing what education should be and what it shouldn't be and how we value that. And so, although we are at a different place now that we do have people of all genders and of different cultural and ethnic backgrounds in place, a lot of the practices that we have are still based in white supremacy characteristics, such as paternalism, such as the binary, such as this view of one right way, right? That there's only one right way to do something. And if you do it in another way, you're not going to be successful, or, you know, the worship of the written word is another good one that's on there, and again that quantity aspect. So I think it's important for us to understand that this is an ecosystem within itself, and that affects each of us individually, and to show like how this works, it's eurocentrism and white supremacy characteristics are at the top, right? These are the things that affect higher ed institutions as a whole. This one right way, these isolation tactics, this the very much like these people have a control over your path, and if you don't follow or fit into this mold, you will not see success. And so because of these practices, they're embedded into our institutional and departmental policies and procedures, So they're actually within like the written word within the colleges of how we should be able to function and how we are able to communicate with each other, which then lead to the normalization of white supremacy characteristic practices and high control practices and these groupthink aspects, which then affect all students, all faculty and staff, and are impacted by the power structure. So this doesn't just affect the most marginalized. Does it disproportionately affect the most marginalized? Absolutely. Women are most affected, people of color are most affected, people with disabilities, LGBTQ, gender nonconforming, all of that. But the people who do benefit from this, anyone who is white, cisgender, male, all of that, you too are impacted by this, because then it goes into this cycle of like, well, I'm doing well, so like, why can't you do well? Or I'm successful in this area, but like, I don't understand like why you have such a big problem with this. So it's a very it's very important that if those types of things are happening within the system, that means the system's working, which then reinforces the system to continue happening at play. And honestly, this line that goes back to the top, all of these lines could honestly affect one another and that they seep into each other. That means the cycle is working. So I think it's important to just recognize that this is what's existing right now. And it does look, and I know that Nora and I are talking about a lot of like the negatives that come with being a college student, but again, this is just to have an awareness that I would say that we wish we could have had during our collegiate music experience, and that we want all of you to have. But Nora, I
Especially,
definitely want to throw it over to you.
yeah, definitely. Again, the some of these factors aren't inherently bad, right? Again, having one-on-one time with your teacher, not a bad thing. But when you're already having all of these external factors, things that, isolation, sleep deprivation, being in systems that are upholding Eurocentrism, those factors can then allow predators to thrive and make students more susceptible to being victims. So it's not an inherent thing where everything in this system is bad. We are pointing these out because they are allowing predators to thrive, and being aware of them, being aware of these tactics, being aware of how the wrong person can use these circumstances for their own gain is the important part of this. And then how do we break this down so that that can't happen in the first place? How can we start to remove some of those things? So it's not all bad news, because there you do have power, and we do have some ways that we can do a better job breaking these systems down.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think it's important for us to end on a note of, what do you have power over? What do each of you all within this space, and I know that we have students, parents, faculty, and staff here. And so we want to leave you all with things that will make you feel more empowered to take action, because again, we can't change the entire system. But what we can do is disrupt it. What we can do is ask questions so that we can get to the so that we can see the future that we would like to see, right? So one of the aspects on here is to redirect power to students. And so this is going back to, encouraging students to explore and navigate their career path, their education, and being able to see what is available for them within and outside of the department. I would even say exploring them to get involved outside of the music school. And I know that's so scary for some of us, but it is important for people to recognize that they have a place outside of the College of Music or School of Music as well, within the institution, and that there's so many resources out there that they also paid for. They also paid those student fees. So like, have them take advantage of all those. Establishing feedback loops with advisors and faculty. So making sure that it's not just a one direction, you take my advice and that's it. What are the ways that we can offer advice or feedback to each other, or have regular check-ins of how we're doing, right? Maybe it is just the first 15 minutes each month in one of your private lessons of just kind of talking about how are things going, what are things that I can do better as a faculty or as your studio professor, what are things that I feel that you should do better as a student. These build rapport and also, I would say, relieve some of the stress of faculty even having to take the lead all the time, because there is a lot that's asked of you all, and there's a lot that's also asked of the students. So what can we do to nourish that relationship? And then looking for yourself in your music. Ask your professors to have composers or music that represents you and your culture, if that is something that you're striving for. Nora, I see you coming in.
Yeah, I think an important thing with all of this again is that you pay the bills, whether it's you or your parents, and we'll talk about parents as well, or your guardians. You have the power in this situation. You are part of this system. You should have the power to ask for different feedback. So, again, personal experience. I ask my professor very frequently, like, I need, as a student, the things that make me successful, I need deliverables. I need really clear structure around how we're engaging in lessons, in things like that. And if your teachers aren't receptive to that, that is a problem, right? Like, yes, there are some things you can ask for and they're just never gonna, it's not possible. But if you're asking for things that are going to help you and your teacher isn't even willing to meet you in that conversation, that's a problem. And so when you're going into these schools, when you're having these conversations, finding professors that are like receptive to that, finding people that are willing and able to meet you part way, and are willing to take feedback, willing to have these conversations, I think is really, really important. Another thing I want to point out is what you have your studio professor, and that's kind of the thing that I think everyone focuses on when they go into these schools. But who else is there? What other faculty can guide and support you? So who will your advisors be outside of music? Are there other advisory councils, functions, people that you can get partnered with? Are there any checks and balances outside of your studio professor? Right now, and like at this school, are there ways to get more support? Things like that are really, really important. And again, when it comes to like looking for yourself in your music, is that something that your professors at this school are open to? Are they open to studying new composers? Are they open to looking outside of the traditional aspect? um and I think that that's a really important thing to have those conversations around and see how open to that they are. Are you going to go to this school and find out that you only can have conversations around Beethoven? Or are you going to be encouraged to step outside of that? And I think, real quick, again, as we're talking about these, I have seen a few different things in the chat right now about how so much of this does fall on faculty. And I just think that's an important note that has come up in a few different ways, and we can kind of go into this. But there is a lot of pressure on the faculty to be the soul changers. And so I think students having these conversations and faculty being receptive to these, but also letting students, I think encouraging students to help be a part of the process of self guiding and curiosity, and empowering them, which we'll also talk about in a couple of slides, gives them some of this power. Again, if you're feeling this burden as a faculty member, by empowering your students to help you change the system, I think that's a huge thing to just keep in mind, is how can we continue to empower our students to be a part of this change.
Yeah. And I know that we're running out of time here, so we're gonna move through these next couple of slides a little bit faster. But I think it's important for parents, and honestly, I should have put parents and guardians on here. I think it's important to understand the student commitment. And so I think some action items that you all can take, Nora mentioned this, but some, like we say, the students are the people who are paying for it. It could be y'all that are actually paying for your child's education, or for your students' education. So you also have the power to ask. You also have the ability to understand what your student is going through at the institution, and can push for changes to happen as well. I think one of the most important things that can be done is teaching your child how to set boundaries. I think understanding that we only have a certain capacity within the day, right? Like the amount of all-nighters that I did while in college was not helpful for me. So I think even creating boundaries for myself and for other people and having those tools would have benefited me so much, and my overall health and well-being, so that I could have graduated maybe not as burnt out or burnt out at all. And so that is also something that I feel can be taught by those who do have more power within their lives now, right? As someone that was coming out of high school, I didn't really understand power dynamics and how that comes into play. All I knew was that I was a student and I was supposed to learn. And that was all I was supposed to do. So I was supposed to listen to the other person. But I think boundary setting is a way to redistribute that power again. And so that students feel that they can push and understand what power they have within the institution. And then, of course, active listening on faculty relationships. So understanding, asking questions about how things are going within the school, recognizing if there are any toxic patterns that are happening with maybe some of the faculty that your student has interactions with, and being able to address those, so that they don't face that isolation that is so common, because everyone else might be also experiencing it. So we might see it as normal as a student, but us as adults that are out of that space might be like, hey, actually, that's not normal, or that's not okay. And you're able to come in and disrupt that, so that that student doesn't get impacted by that isolation, nor anything to add.
Just with active listening, one thing is with those boundary setting, even things that seem innocuous, of pushing of boundaries, if that's a pattern, if your student is like, oh, well, my teacher made me do this thing that I'm really uncomfortable with, or I said no, I didn't have time to do another chamber ensemble, and they really just like pushed, and now I'm in it. That pattern of boundary breaking is really important to pay attention to and to listen to, because if someone is continuously showing signs of breaking boundaries, and crossing into things that your student might have already said no to. And again, this isn't, my teacher said that I have to practice and I said no, and now they're saying I have to practice. That's not crossing a boundary, right? Like there are certain things, but if they're saying you need to practice 50 hours a week and I'm saying I can't physically do that, that's a boundary. Those are things to listen for, and those patterns and those red flags. So that's just something to be aware of. And even as teachers, other admin, etc., to listen to those red flags when it comes to boundaries. If you're hearing, the same professor crossing, into credit hour like issues, or things like that repeatedly, that's something to be aware of, because that pattern speaks to larger issues at play.
Absolutely. And faculty and staff, I think it's important to recognize and redistribute power. So kind of how we mentioned before, are you providing a space that there's an equal interaction with feedback and giving advice, or even educating, right? I think if you're a true educator and really enjoy educating people, you recognize that your students teach you as well, on how to be a better educator. And so redistributing those power dynamics is definitely important. And I think it's also needed for advocacy for students in faculty and staff spaces, right? So if there are issues that are coming up with students, with the people that you're working with, I would even say if there are issues even coming up with other faculty and staff, right? We know you all are also humans. So are you advocating for your time and your space within faculty and staff spaces? For a student, they're not able to be in those faculty and staff spaces. So are you advocating for them, to ensure that their well-being is taken care of, to ensure that their needs are heard, especially if it's happening to more than one student? then this is something that the institution or the department has to address. I think also going back to the recognize and redistribute power, I see in the chat here, just like talking about, someone asked a question, like, how do we do all of this, recognizing that our time is also spread so thin, right? So again, those white supremacy characteristics coming at play, the quantity over quality, right? These super spread thin hours, having these very human discussions with students is something that I wish I could have had, because I think that there's such a pressure on faculty and educators to know everything and to have all the answers, when we are all just these, beings with skin and flesh on this giant moving rock like everybody else, and just trying to figure out how do we get through a day by day. And so what are the things that we can do within these student interactions to also not only humanize the student, but humanize ourselves, right? Being like, hey, I'm not going to lie, I have a really tough week coming up. Here's some of the things that I can do to support you. Here are some of the things that could help me show up better for you as a faculty member. And it may not be the absolute solution for everything, but at least I know, and it's modeled for me, the boundaries that you are creating, and also being like, here are the ways that I can show up for you this week. Here are the ways that I could show up for you this next month, be due to my hectic schedule. It takes a lot of vulnerability to do that, and we have to crush that ego that tells us that we have to have it all together all the time, when that's not actually the case. We don't have to have it all together all the time, and we shouldn't. We're supposed to make mistakes, and we're supposed to rely on community to help us move forward. And then again, just encouraging that curiosity and student self-discovery. What are the discussions you're having? That are talking about what your career can look like within the music space, outside of the music space, and getting them connected with people even outside of the music school, so that the student can propel forward. And again, that takes some of the weight off of you, to know all the answers or feel like you have to be the sole person to guide them. Nora, I know we got like maybe like 30 seconds or something.
Yeah, definitely. Real quick, to echo that again, redistributing that power is going to help you. So encouraging your students to ask the right questions, encouraging your students, again, to use their collective power to help incentivize change. There's a really interesting conversation in here going on about, obviously these professors are also out doing research opportunities, making music, performing in ensembles, and that does benefit the student. So if they're, someone pointed out, if they have 30 people in their studio, that's already 30 hours a week. And so having students advocate for that like, no, I don't want to be in a studio with 30 people. Like what we really need from our professors is 15 hour, people in a studio or whatever. Like the students also have the power to have these conversations. And I think that that's really important, in encouraging them, especially to get their parents involved, because a lot of times the schools have power dynamics. They hold on to these, financial barriers, etc. But when it comes to parents, they're less likely to do that. So helping your students feel empowered and your students' parents and guardians feel empowered to ask for the change that is needed, can help remove, I think, some of that burden from you as a faculty member. I also think re-evaluating what this structure is in general. I think that's been part of this conversation. Someone referred to, you find a master performer and go apprentice them, and that this is a traditional music pedagogy, but why? Right? Like, does that need to exist? Or is it the balance that's off? Is it that you have 30 students and you're being a master teacher? That's an issue. But also, like we talked about, is not every person that is a master player is a master teacher. And so finding that balance, finding what works. Is it that every person needs to be in the New York that's, teaching at a college, or are there other things that we should be looking for? So I just think in general, sitting down with the current structure and having those conversations among other faculty, and really reevaluating and asking yourself the hard questions, and where your bias lays, where the institutional bias lays. What are we elevating, and why are we in these models? Do these models even work? If they're not working for you as a teacher, they're not working for me as a student, they're not working for the administration, then who are we serving? Because we're not serving you, we're not serving our students, we're not serving the institution. Where are we serving? Just the bottom line of the institution? And if that's the case, then that doesn't feel correct. Right? So I think you are allowed to, as a teacher, ask, who is this serving? It's not serving me, it's not serving my students, so what do we do from here? And I think that's a big part of what these conversations are. The conversations we have at our collegiate conference that I mentioned are that's administration focused on our recruitment and and admission teams and DEI teams. But I think that again, that's just all things to have conversations around. And you can have those conversations and you can lead those conversations. And I think being really vulnerable, as Alma mentioned, is a huge part of that.
Absolutely. And remember, y'all are also alumni of your own institutions, and you can also push back at the universities that you were at about these different things that probably affected you as well while you were a student, right? And so you also have that power within these other areas. Let's say if you're not teaching at the place that you studied at, to have the administration change, to talk about these things that are probably affecting the current student population as well as the current student faculty, or as well as the current faculty and staff. um
And sorry, just one more
mhm,
piggyback off of that, 'cause it's a great point. If you don't feel comfortable because your paycheck is tied to this institution, right, it can be hard to make waves.
correct.
We just talked about this power dynamic with students of if their, you know, finances are tied up in this organization. Again, those high control group dynamics, like that applies to you as well as a faculty member if you're experiencing those. So look for these other alternatives, right? Like you just said, if you can go back to your alma mater if you're not working there and say, no, these are the things that need to change. And you can push for it there because there aren't going to be ramifications to you specifically. But again, that collective power, if Eastman is doing it, if USC is doing it, if Michigan is doing it, if they're making these changes, then you can go, then your school you can point to and say, well, they're doing it. Why can't we do it? Right.
Mhm.
And so that can help you build that collective power in a way that is less risky to you.
Absolutely.